On our Vision Weekend, which was 2 weekends ago, I got an invitation to go and speak at a session of another church's Vision Weekend, so I fitted it in there somewhere in the weekend, and they asked me to speak around the subject of personal finances. I started going through some of my preaching archives, things that we've preached, and I found a slide from 2015. We did a series on finances called Loaded, and some of you might remember that far back. But I added to it a picture of an aeroplane because the picture that I used was this. When it comes to our finances, there are certain biblical principles that, when in place in our lives, help move the aeroplane forward. One of them is the principle of tithing. I'm going to be concentrating on that engine this morning. But there are 3 other engines that the Bible speaks about, and that's the engine of giving, the engine of saving, and the engine of spending wisely. When it comes to the back 3 engines, different of us have different strengths on those engines. The reason I'm just putting this up briefly this morning is as a reminder, just to look at those 4 things and to say, God, in 2018, where can we be doing better? Maybe our savings engine needs a bit of a tweak, or maybe our spending wisely engine needs to be looked at, or the giving engine. And the point I was making during that series is that it's possible for a plane to fly with only one engine, but not very good for the plane and not very safe for the passengers. All 4 were designed to be in operation to move that airplane forward. But the first engine, the engine of the tithe, is something I've been looking at, listening to other guys talking about it, and I've got so excited actually about the power of the tithe. If I was to give this morning a message, actually, it would be this. Give this morning a title, it would be this, is First Things First. First Things First. Now, before I launch into that, by way of a starting point or a backdrop, I'd like to make this point. And if you've got some way of taking notes today, there's a couple of things that you might find useful to write down. So if you've got some way of typing notes or writing notes, please do so. This is the big idea which I'm kicking off with today, is that God is relentless about being first. God is relentless about being first. Now, if that sounds a slightly unique or strange concept to you, let me take this as an idea, or take these as 2 verses. Jesus was once asked this by a Bible teacher, a rabbi, a teacher of the law. The teacher said to him this. He said, "Which is the greatest commandment in the law? What is the most important? What's number 1? Jesus, in your opinion?" What was Jesus' reply? What's up on the screen behind me now? Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. In the Gospel of Mark, there's another phrase added on, and all your strength. That is pretty all-consuming, wouldn't you say? Like, God wants everything. All your heart, all your soul, all your mind. Jesus says that's the biggest idea. What he said actually echoes the first commandment in the 10 commandments. Those of you that remember the book of Exodus, God gave Moses a list of 10 commandments. Now, the commandments that most easily come to mind, if I was to ask you, what can you remember of the 10 commandments? You might remember the commandments like, do not commit adultery and do not steal. The last one, do not covet. But do you know what the first commandment is? Commandment number 1. You shall have no other God besides me. God is relentless in this idea throughout the Bible. I am first in the universe, and I want to be first in your life. First things first. In fact, the big question that we could ask, and this is a very challenging question, I'm preaching at anybody, looking in the mirror. This is the question that comes from these 2 verses. God could effectively be asking us through those 2 verses, am I first in your life today? Am I first? There's a big difference between the word Lord and the word genie. Are you familiar with the word genie? Okay, that's me then. Remember the story of Aladdin, those that remember it. There's not the Bible story, incidentally. It's a made-up story. Aladdin finds the lamp, rubs the lamp, and a genie appears. Now, the thing about a genie is he's all-powerful. You're working with me here, hey? Still working with my last question, and I'm moving forward here. The genie's all-powerful, and he follows the lamp rubber's commands. So the genie says, well, you've got 3 wishes. Whatever you want, I'll do. Many of us have got a picture of God that he's like a genie. Is if I rub the lamp by doing whatever, if I pray enough or read the Bible enough or live a good enough Christian life, that God is at my beck and call and does whatever I want him to do. Nothing could be further from the truth. The truth is the word Lord, is where he's the master and I'm the servant. And whatever he says, I do. And he says, my number 1 commandment is, Steve, I want to be first in your life. Why would God be so big? Why is he so relentless on being first? I think it's for these 2 reasons. First of all, he is first. Everywhere. The entire world is made at his command. I'm using the word first this morning, but another word for it could be the word supreme. God is supreme. God exists everywhere. There's nothing that came before him. He is the primary being in the world. All of us are derivatives. We were all created by a bigger being. He's the greater being. He's first. So he wants that reality to become our reality. And here's the second reason, I believe, is because God designed us that our lives work best when he is first. So because he loves us so much, because he loves, let's use our family as an example, because he loves Jackie and I enough to die for us, he says, I want to be first in your life. And at first, that sounds a bit overwhelming because I'm born with me first. I'm first. And he says, you shall have no other gods besides me, not even you. So I say, well, God, I want you to be first. I'm not exactly sure what that means. And as I allow him, or step off the throne if you like, and he comes into first place, my life suddenly starts to live the way it was designed to be lived. That's not to say all my problems disappear, not at all. Some problems only start then. But I was designed to have God first. That's why he's so relentless, because he loves me and he wants to be first in my life. Now, to use a very poor example of what happens when you don't put the right things in first, Jackie's father won a bread making machine, but he never used it, and so he gave it to us. We haven't used it that often, but it's been, when we've gone on holiday sometimes, it's so nice because you chuck in all the ingredients. There's a picture of our bread maker there somewhere, thank you. You can kind of see that. Chuck in all the ingredients into the thing, push the button, and you arrive home from the beach a couple of hours later, there's this beautiful smell of hot bread. Oh, and it tastes amazing. The boys love it. One day we go off to the beach and we come back and you can smell the beautiful smell. And I open the lid and I look inside and there is this congealed mess. And I know I put the right ingredients in the flour and the water and the yeast and everything it told me. I was the bread maker for that day. I dished it all in. And yet I tell you what it produced, I would not have eaten. Do you know what I left out? The little blade. There you can kind of see it, my finger's holding it in that photo. That little blade attaches to a little spindle at the bottom of the bread making machine. Without that blade going in first, the loaf was ruined. Exactly the same ingredients, just not the right things in the right order. It's no good at the end chucking in the blade and saying, okay, everything went in that was meant to be, and no, it's got to be in the right order. The blade first, and then all the ingredients, and then the bread gets made. Another better example of when things are in the right order, it goes well. And it's an example the Bible uses often as the example of marriage. For a marriage to work, it would not, in what order shall I word these sentences? Let's say I arrive home to Jackie and I say, I love people so much, I've decided you're on an equal level with every other woman in the world. Why is that not good for our marriage? It's because marriage is a relationship that she wants to know that she is first in my heart and in my life, and I want to know that I'm first in hers. And anything that's not that hide behind whatever else, call it whatever name you want to call it, this relationship ain't going to go better. Because we were designed for this idea of primacy. That's in a marriage relationship. And at eternal spiritual level, we were designed for primacy. God first. That's why he's so relentless about it. He's God. He's doing it for my good and because he loves me. And when it comes to our personal finances, he goes to great lengths to remind his people throughout the Bible, first of all, that he owns it all. There's repeated verses. One of them is in Deuteronomy chapter 10:14 that just says basically the heavens belong to God and the earth belongs to God and everything in the earth belongs to God. The chair you're sitting on, who's the ultimate owner of that chair? God, according to Deuteronomy 10. If you've got $100 in your wallet, who owns that $100? Ultimately, according to Deuteronomy 10, God. He goes to great lengths to remind us that he doesn't just own it all, but he gave us the ability to produce wealth. In Deuteronomy chapter 8, he says, don't say, it's my hands that created all of this, because who gave you basically the ability to produce wealth? Who gave you the hands, the brain, the heart, the breath, the capacity? He says it's God. And he goes to great lengths to remind us that he wants first place in our handling of finances, which all belong to him and which only came to us because he gave us the ability. Now, I reckon that God did this, went to these great lengths because he knew that us, people like us, through the ages, would tend to see God's stuff as their stuff and tend to figure that our hands produced it all and forget that God owns it all and gave us the ability to produce any wealth. All wealth, I mean. Now, in my opinion, this is one of the reasons for the biblical principle of tithing. If you get paid monthly, every single month that you and I get paid, essentially we're being asked this question: who's first? Who's first in your heart? Now, in money, that's a whole lot more tricky than on other things. Because in other things we can kind of say, well, God, I think you're mostly first. But money looks a bit different. You see, money represents our time and represents our energy. It also represents our aspirations and represents our living in the month that comes. So, there's so many verses on this topic, but I've just picked 3 this morning. Jackie can tell you, in preparing this, I'd approached it from so many different angles, so many starting points, but I've picked these 3 verses for today to try and explain this idea of first things first, the way the Bible sees it. And these are the 3 verses. I'm going to put them up and then go one by one through each of them. Leviticus 27:30. A tithe of everything from the land, whether grain from the soil or fruit from the trees, belongs to the Lord. It is holy to the Lord. I'll come back and explain that a bit. I'm just reading them now. Proverbs 3:9 and 10. Honor the Lord with your possessions. This is the verse that goes up when we bring our tithes and offerings. Honor the Lord with your possessions, with the first fruits of all your increase, so that your barns will be filled with plenty, your vats will brim over with new wine. And the third verse, Exodus 23, verse 19. The best of the first fruits of your land you shall bring to the house of the Lord your God. So clicking back to that Leviticus verse, if you could just leave it up there. Now, some of you might be saying this as you observe the verses I read. Say, yeah, but the verses that you're commenting on are all from the Old Testament under the law. A couple of comments in relation to that. This is my main point, but just a couple of comments. First of all, the idea of first fruits and the idea of tithing came way before the law, is even earlier in the New Testament throughout the book of Genesis. The first children in the Bible, Cain and Abel, ended up having some problems. And it was related to, it's in Genesis chapter 4. It says, Cain brought some of the fruit of the soil because he was a farmer. But it says Abel brought the first fruits, some of the first fruits of his offering. Right there you see that God's interested in what comes first, not just something in the middle, but the first. Genesis chapter 12, the first idea of somebody giving a tenth is, Genesis 14 is Abraham encountering Melchizedek, a priest that he had never met before, priest of God Most High, sees God as higher than everything, it says, and he gave him a tenth of everything. And the third mention of it is also in Genesis. It says, Jacob said to God, if you bless me, of everything you give me, I will give you a tenth. That's way before the law. A. Secondly, there's other principles in the law, like do not commit adultery and do not steal. They carry through well into the New Testament. In fact, they get a little tweak from Jesus in the New Testament. So I don't believe this is a principle that stops. If anything, I think it needs to improve. And thirdly, Jesus in Matthew 23:23 said this about tithing, is keep on doing it, basically. So for all of those reasons, I'm using these verses. But for me, it's not an arm wrestle per se. I'm just telling you what I believe the Bible is saying. And hopefully it can be of benefit. So Leviticus 27 says a tithe of everything from the land needs to be brought to, belongs to God. So a tithe, that word tithe is very simply a tenth. God says basically of all the stuff, all of my stuff that's in your hands, all the increase that you have, as we'll see in the next verse, the first tenth of it is unique. He uses this phrase, he says, it belongs to the Lord. In other words, it doesn't belong to me to spend as I want. It belongs to God. He says it's unique. He said to his people then, he says, this is holy. In other words, don't touch my tenth. Don't touch the first part of my tenth. Why, here's a question, why did God pick a tenth and not a ninth or not an 11th or not a 12th or a 20th or a 5th? Here's the answer, I don't know. He just did. He could have picked any number. I think one of the reasons he made it a percentage is because it's then applicable to everybody. No matter how much you earn, if it's this much, it's a tenth. And if it's that much, it's a tenth. So God said to everybody that's reading this in Leviticus, a tenth of everything belongs to me. It's mine. Interestingly, I don't know why he used the number 10, but the number 10 is often linked to testing throughout the Bible. And I only saw this recently, actually through listening to somebody else. I thought, wow, that's brilliant. Now I'm going to ask you a series of questions, and I'm going to ask you to answer out loud. Okay? And the number, I'm going to give you up front what the answer is to the first question. It's the number 10. How many plagues were there to test Pharaoh? 10. How many commandments were there, which were set as tests? Exodus 20. How many times were Jacob's wages changed, and the Bible said his heart was tested? 10 is the right answer. There's a pattern here. If you say 10, you're going to be right, okay? How many times were Jacob's wages changed? And his heart was tested. Good. How many times did God test Israel in the wilderness, according to the Old Testament? Good. How many days was Daniel tested in Daniel chapter 1? Great. Some of you are getting the pattern. Others not so sure about this. How many virgins were there tested, whether they were ready, in Matthew 25? How many days of testing are there mentioned in Revelation 2? How many disciples were there? There were 12. That was just a trick. So I don't know why God picked 10, said a tenth, but I see that throughout the Bible, this number 10 is often linked to testing. God does it over and over. Now, I'd like to try and illustrate this, maybe by way of picture, this idea of the tithe. And I need a couple of guys to help me. Dusty, would you mind? No, in fact, you've been up here quite a lot. Eric, Graham, and Ernie, would you mind if I borrowed you guys? The three wise men seated here in the front row. If you wouldn't mind just coming up and standing here. All of these three absolute legends in their own right. So, let's say that I was going away for a couple of months. And for some reason, I decided in order to get monthly finance to my family, to Jackie and the boys, I gave a certain amount of money to Ernie, a certain amount of money to Graham, and a certain amount of money to Eric. I said, you can invest it, use it however you want. All that I'm asking is of the increase that you produce, of any money you make, I'm asking that 10% you just send through monthly through to the kids. Everybody gratefully accepts the money to invest in various enterprises and various things. After a little while, I've been away for a little while, and I phoned back home, and I say to Jax, we're chatting about how the boys are, and I say to her, by the way, is the money coming through? And she says, well, the money that you gave Eric, that's been coming through every month. There's been an amount coming through. It seems like it's a tenth of the increase. And she says, and with Graham, the money that you gave him, there's been money coming through every month. And he's been so grateful. I'm so grateful for his diligence. I say, what about Ernie? She says, I haven't heard from Ernie. Sorry, Ernie. You just happened to be standing this. Haven't heard from Ernie. In 3 months, I haven't seen a thing. Now, this is a very, very generous man. In fact, he handles a lot of our giving that we do as a church. But if I was then to go away the following year for another few months, do you think I'd include Ernie in my plans to get money back to my wife and my kids? No, because of what happened the previous year. Thanks so much, guys. Please give them a massive round of applause. What does the Bible say is the bride of Christ or the family of God? It's the local church. And so somehow in God's wisdom, he says, all the money I give you, I'm asking that you give a tenth. And it's going to go to the bride, if you like. It's going to go to the family. And what I mean by that is it's going to go to the local church who hopefully will advance my kingdom with it. The second verse that we read is Proverbs chapter 3, verse 9 and 10. It says, honor the Lord with your possessions, with the first fruits of all your increase. So this is this idea of the tithe. So that your barns will be filled with plenty, your vats will brim over with new wine. A couple of things from this verse. First of all is the word honor. Basically, the writer of this proverb is saying, by being faithful with my first fruits, I'm honoring God. That links to my idea of God is in first place. The second word I'd like you to notice is the word first fruits. The idea behind the tithe wasn't that it's the last thing that I give if I have nothing more to spend it on. It's an act of faith because by giving the first fruits, I'm trusting that God will bless the 90. I'm coming back to that first tenth of another reason why I want to give it. But this idea is, I give it first. I give it in faith. I don't wait to see what's going to happen to the other 90. Do you know that in the New Testament, the Bible refers to Jesus Christ as the first fruits and the firstborn? When God gave Christ, we could say in some ways that it was, in inverted commas, a tithe. Because he gave Christ, not waiting to see whether all of us would follow Christ or clean up our act. He gave what the New Testament says was the first fruits offering, Jesus Christ dying on the cross, with faith, if you like, that we would accept his sacrifice on our behalf. The third word I'd like you to notice in this verse is the word increase. It's with the first fruits of the increase. It's what God is giving into my hand. So let's say that in a month, let's say in a very simple business kind of idea, I'm speaking about an individual goes and gets a contract to do a job, maybe landscape a garden. And the cost of the plants to put into their garden are 5,000 rand. And the cost of the other materials and labor are another 5,000 rand. So that's what it's going to cost. And you invoice out on that job 15,000 rand. Okay, I'm using a very simple example here. What would the profit be on that? What would your increase be? Would be the 5. Okay? So the first tenth of that is the first fruits or the tithe that God says belongs to me. And the 90% of God's money that stays with me, he says, this is what I want to do with it. I want to fill your barns with plenty so that your vats will brim over with new wine. A lot of people see this idea of first fruits as, well, God wants to take something from me. First of all, it's not mine, it's his. But secondly, God doesn't want to take from me, he wants to give to me. And in this divine mathematics, in this idea of first fruits and the tithe, I put God first and I say, boy, okay, by faith. And God says, actually, my reason I'm doing this is so that you can benefit, that your life, remember I said when God's first, things go as they should be. God says, I'm looking to fill your barns and fill your vats. And I've heard so many people share so many different stories of how God did this in so many different ways as they honored him. It's a tithe on the increase, for our increase. It's not God wanting to do worse to us. He doesn't need our money. He has no need of our tithe. When Jackie and I tithe, as we do, we've attempted to do it on all increase that comes to us. We're not doing it because God needs our money. He doesn't. He owns everything already. But on every salary that we get, the first payment that happens is tithe. When we get money in, there was some cash that came in, gifts over Christmas and for our boys, and we taught them this principle as well. This is sometimes how it happens. Levi will bring his money and he'll say, Dad, could you keep this safe for me? And I'll say, I'll keep it safe with pleasure. Would you like, I'm reminding him, would you like to take the tithe out and we've got another place for the tithes? So we never get the money mixed up. Oh, yes, please. Then Ethan comes with money. We're going to put the tithe separately to the rest of the money so that it doesn't get mixed up, God's money and what we're spending inadvertently. Jackie and I have endeavored to do the same. And when we've had any increase on the sale of something, increase through gifts, God's got incredible ways of pushing grain into the barns. When we've had increase, the first tenth, we've endeavored to the best of our ability to bring it back. Because that's what these verses talk about. The third verse is the idea is Exodus 23. It says, the best of the first fruits of your land you shall bring to the house of the Lord your God. So it's repeating this idea of first fruits. There's so many verses on this. But it says this is bring it to the house of the Lord your God. This was the idea throughout the Old Testament as it comes back to the house, if you like, where you're getting fed. The idea of the tithe, in my understanding, our understanding, is that as it carries through into the New Testament, the local church is the place where our tithes should be brought. That's the place that we're getting fed. That's not to say with the second engine of giving that we aren't giving offerings into all different good endeavors and great organizations that are doing amazing things. We're looking to give above and beyond the tithe. But our tithe, the first fruits, we bring to the house of the Lord our God, our house, where our local church is. Now, there's an interesting thing in these verses that we've read. The Bible never ever says give our tithes. Never give our tithes. It always says bring the tithe. Why does it say that? Because it's not ours. Remember that first verse we read? It said the tithe belongs to God in a very, very unique way. So it's certainly in our mind and our finances, I don't say, you know what, Jax? Oh, I tell you, God has just amazing grace, how sweet the sound. I'd like to give God something this month. We're going to give our tithes. No. Our tithes, we're bringing them back. God said those belong to me. Maybe I can use this by another way of example. Let me not pick on Ernie this time. Let's take Dusty. The guy's got that high pain threshold for those earrings. Let's say that Dusty took me to the airport. I was flying up to Joburg for a few days, and I arranged for him to drive me there, keep the car, use it for those 3 days, and come and pick me up again. So he comes to pick me up. I say, here, the car keys. We're going down in my car. Drops me at the airport, and 3 days later, he comes back to pick me up. And as he picks me up at the airport, I walk out, and we greet each other. And as we're walking back to the car, he says, Tennille and I have been thinking, and we're so grateful to you for your friendship, Steve, and for just everything. We've decided we would like to give you a car. And he gives me back my car keys. So I get these car keys in my hand. I say, but this is my car. He says, no, come, we want to give you this car. Walk over there, and it's my car. Open it. And Dusty says, we just wanted to give it to you. Why would that be all kinds of wrong? Because it wasn't his. It was mine. So this was the idea that God gave to his people in the Old Testament, is that first tenth belongs to me. And you've got two choices of what to do with it. You can either bring it or steal it. Did I hear somebody say, yeah. Hang on to it. Keep it for yourself. And this was the big idea in the Old Testament. There's a verse in Malachi, which was the last book in the Old Testament, that actually pulls all of these ideas together. And it's such a powerful verse. And yet, because money is so deeply, I would say, like personal and emotive, for a whole lot of us, we just kind of steer around this. But this is what Malachi chapter 3 says. This is the prophet bringing a message from God to the people of that time. He says, will a mere mortal rob God? This is the message, guys. God says, are you mere mortals going to rob me? And you ask, oh, yet you rob me. Yet you ask, how are we robbing you? How can we rob God who owns everything, who sees everything? And this is God's answer. In tithes and offerings. You're under a curse, your whole nation, because you're robbing me. You're keeping my tenth. Bring the whole tithe into the storehouse, that there may be food in my house. The words that and the food in my house means that the entire church can be well fed. Test me in this, says the Lord Almighty. Boy, this is a strong phrase. Remember I said just now, I don't know why the number 10, but the number 10 is always linked to testing. So the tithe tests my heart. It tests my priorities every month. Is God first? Is God first? Am I following? Now, God reverses it, and he says, actually, you can put me to the test. So I've been testing you. Stephen Jacks, whoever. I'm testing you, and I do it with faith. Bring my tithe. Bring the tithe. And he says, now you can test me. And this is the only time in the whole Bible God gives us this permission. Actually, the rest of the Bible, it says, don't test God. Just this once. Test me in this, says the Lord Almighty. That word means he has all power. He's an infinite God. And see if I will not throw open the floodgates of heaven and pour out so much blessing that there will not be room enough to store it. I will prevent pests from devouring your crops, and the vines in your fields will not drop their fruit before it is ripe. That related to these people's primary business, the business of farming. Whatever your primary business, primary income, God says, I want to provide and I want to protect. Then all nations will call you blessed, for yours will be a delightful land, says the Lord Almighty. He says, and we've spoken about the principle of this first fruit, but God says, actually, you can test me. And he says, I want to provide for you, and I want to protect you. I wonder if perhaps when he says, will a man rob God, he's referring also to this idea. Is will a man rob God of the opportunity to bring the provision and the protection that comes from bringing his tithe, returning the tithe? I'm fully aware of a whole lot of different emotions and conversations that happen in people's minds when this kind of thing is spoken about, because I've had those discussions one-on-one with a whole lot of people on different things. Incidentally, if this is your first time to church, this is not our weekly message. But I feel I would be doing a tremendous disservice to anybody if I and us as elders, we believe that this is true, if we hang on to that. That would be very, very unkind, and that would be exceptionally, unusually cruel. So one day, and I've told this story once or twice before, so if you've heard it, here's the repeat. But one day we traveled with the team up into Malawi, and I felt God guide me to speak on those, I didn't call them engines back then, but those 4 principles. Spoke about the tithe. And I have to tell you, I was very sheepish in doing so. We've arrived in a vehicle. Everybody that we're talking to doesn't own a vehicle. Everybody there pretty much are subsistence farmers. We're in a rural area, far from any major Malawian cities. And Malawi is a pretty poor country, but exceptionally warm and friendly. And as we're talking in this little church with little mud benches that people are sitting on, and a thatch roof, and mud brick walls, I'm busy talking in these principles, and I'm thinking to myself, I believe all of this is true, but boy, this just seems contextually a little bit of a misclick. But I felt God guide me to do it. At the end of that session, the interpreter, who was one of the pastors from Malawi, said, there's a man here, a local church leader, who'd like to talk to you. So I thought maybe he was having some of those arguments with me that I was actually having with myself around the contextual fit and all that. It wasn't anything of the sort. This man's name was Medicine Bazai. And I remember that so clearly because what he said stuck with me as one of the greatest messages on tithing that I'd ever heard. He just told me some of his story. As we sat down there, he said, I live over here, and he showed me where his maize was, just behind us. And he said, when I first became a Christian, I was taught these principles. And he said, I went back to my maize, and he said, I didn't have any money, I just had the maize, and I harvested that maize once a year. And he said, the first year of maize, once they've milled it or ground it, it comes back to them in sacks. So he says, I took 1/10 of my maize, and I put it on the back of my bicycle, and I rode through to our local church, and I tithed my maize. And the next year I did the same, and the next year I did the same. And he said, God blessed my maize. He said, the one year in this whole area, there was a bad, bad drought. He said, it only rained in one place. And he pointed with his hands like this. He says, right here over my maize. He says, my maize was big and strong like this. A lot of the other maize struggled that year. So some of my friends thought I was using witchcraft to get rain. But he says, I wasn't. I knew that it was linked to my tithe, to Malachi 3. He says, God blessed my maize, and he says, I was eventually able to buy goats. The first goat and the 11th goat that was born into my herd, I took along, strapped them on the back of my bicycle. It must have been a bumpy journey for that goat, all the way through to the church. And I was trying to imagine being the bookkeeper in that church, recording one goat from medicine. And he tithes his goat. And he says, God blessed my goats that I was able to buy cows. And he said, I never had enough to tithe the whole cow, but if I sold a cow, I took 1/10 of the money. Or if I slaughtered a cow, I took 1/10 of the meat, wrapped it in banana leaves, tied it on the back of my bicycle, and tithed at our local church. He had this big smile. He said, God has enabled me to buy a foot-operated sewing machine for my wife. He says, she sews clothes for many of the people in our village. He says, I'm so grateful to you. Thank you, thank you, thank you for sharing some of these principles with the people here in our village, because we need to hear it. I was so blessed driving all the way back into South Africa, just thinking of Medicine Bazai. Because I had a friend who once said to me, this idea is not good news for the poor. It's only good news for the wealthy. Only wealthy people would be able to do that. What about the poor? I thought back to Medicine Bazai, that actually these principles, that there's not a threshold. It says if you hit over here, then you kick in. No, God says the first 10th belongs to me. I want to see that I'm first in your finances. I think that's what it means. I want to see that I'm first. And I'm not just doing this selfishly because I have no need of your money. I'm doing this to bless you because I want your life to click in. And the way you spend your money is one of the best ways of showing how things are going on the inside. In fact, Jesus said that you can't serve both God and money. So, if you're here this morning and you've been listening to this message, and this is a revelation that you've had and you've brought your tithe, I trust that this morning isn't just a reminder, but can stir great faith in our hearts that says, God, thank you for the blessing you're giving me. I want to bring back the first 10th of the increase, and then I want to look at the other 90% and see how I can give, bless others, sow into different projects, and advance your kingdom, because one day I'm going to die. And I want to invest in things that are eternal. You might be here this morning, and this is something that you haven't dived into, you haven't practiced. If it's because you're uncertain about the actual theologies of it, keep digging. Come talk to one of the elders, one of us, and let's wrestle it through. But if it's, I see it, I just don't do it. I'm asking you this morning to go before God somewhere and say, God, with trepidation and faith, I want to bring my first fruits. I want to bring your tithe and trust you that you will help make it up. We've got guys, I'm just speaking at a very practical level. If you say, I don't even know how to make the budget work without giving God his 10th back. Even if I steal the 10th, it still doesn't add up. We've got guys skilled with finances that would be happy to sit down and actually work through some of that and say some changes and find some way, working together, go on a journey together to bring God's 10th and give it back to Him. I wonder if we could stand together, please.